Hello and welcome to David's Politics Show. Almost uniquely among the states created in the wake of the end of colonialism, Singapore has been blessed by sure-footed and visionary leadership since its separation from Malaysia and full independence in 1965. Lee Kuan Yew's eldest son, Hsien Loong, has now stepped down after 20 years as Prime Minister of Singapore, passing the baton to Lawrence Wong in what is generally known as the transition to 4G, or the fourth generation of political leadership. After a spectacular 60 years of almost uninterrupted economic growth and political stability, however, darker clouds appear to be gathering on the horizon. Economic and social challenges at home, compounded and accelerated by the shifting geopolitical landscape, mean that the small but disproportionately influential city-state of Singapore is likely to be buffeted by strong winds in the decades ahead. With me to discuss the past, present, and future of Singapore's fascinating politics is Professor Eugene Tan, Associate Professor at the School of Law at Singapore Management University. Professor Tan teaches courses on constitutional and administrative law, as well as courses on the law and policy of ethnic relations in Singapore. He has also served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and among other distinctions, he was a nominated Member of Parliament from 2012 to 2014. Professor Tan, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast for the first time. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, David. Thank you for having me. It's really a privilege.
The privilege and the pleasure are both mine. So, Professor Tan, I'm speaking to you, as we were saying right before we started recording from Switzerland. So I'm very far away, or you were far away, depending on how one looks at it. And here in the West, to the extent that people know anything at all about Singapore, they might think that it's so small that it doesn't really have any politics. But I hope in the course of this conversation we'll be able to prove them wrong. And
definitely. I mean, there's so much going on in Singapore.
Right, exactly. In Singapore and in the world. We're recording this on Sunday, July 14th. So this is just after the attempted assassination on former President Trump. There's a huge war raging just a couple of hours to the east of here in Switzerland, and there are tensions in your neck of the woods, right around the South China Sea, and of course the issue of Taiwan. So there's a lot going on in the world these days.
Definitely, in a way, a lot more precarious as well, and that causes a lot of uncertainty, which again then points to the importance of clear-sighted vision.
Absolutely. And so I'd like to begin with precisely foreign policy. Then I'd like to get to the sort of maybe the second half of our conversation to talk a little bit about Singapore's kind of more domestic issues, because even though the two things are ultimately interrelated anyway. But the transition itself, as I said in the intro, we're in this kind of transitional moment. Lawrence Wong is now actually prime minister as opposed to the designated prime minister, and transitions are always a delicate moment, and perhaps especially in the case of small states such as Singapore. And it brings to mind that the year after, in the transition from the sort of 1G to 2G, in the year after Lee Kuan Yew was succeeded by Goh Chok Tong, Singapore's two big brothers, so to speak, two big neighbors, Indonesia and Malaysia, staged a joint military exercise. I think it was with airborne troops, in what was clearly an act of intimidation, if not some sort of provocation. And Singapore reacted with, actually mobilized to some extent its reserves. And anyway, the issue ultimately was settled. It was kind of more of, they didn't really have any intention to go to war, but what about now? I want to start there because, of course, Indonesia and Malaysia are Singapore's eternal neighbors. So, in one way or another, they will have to live together, and they sometimes have had frosty relations with Singapore. So, I want to start by asking you this: do you think they will look to test the new Prime Minister Lawrence Wong early in his new administration?
Well, David, I mean, much has happened, in the last 34 years, and so relations between Singapore and Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, have grown strength to strength. But you're absolutely right. the closest of neighbors will tend to get into disagreements and differences. I think this is very much, a reflection of human nature. I mean, if you think about the sort of arguments and differences and conflicts that we have, they tend to be with those that we are most closely related to.
Yeah.
But I think, it's been 2 months, since Prime Minister Lawrence Wong took over from his predecessor, Hsien Loong. And I think, when you spoke about the geopolitical situation in the world today, with tensions and conflicts, in so many different parts of the world, I think it stands to reason, that countries are a lot more mindful about how they relate to each other. And I think when you look at, the today's transition, Singapore's transition, I mean, in 2004, when Hsien Loong took over as Prime Minister, it was a unipolar world, right? The US was riding high. And, you fast forward 20 years, today, I think that unipolarity is much under threat. The US is uncertain, as you pointed out, with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump today. It reflects, the country being very much at odds with itself.
Right.
So I think when you look at Singapore and Malaysia, I think it is imperative, that Singapore continues to maintain good ties, with both countries. We have to the south Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country, and then you have to the north Malaysia, for which we were a part of Malaysia for about 2 years, right? And of course, over differences how the government ought to be organized, Singapore broke away. But I think what is important is that Singapore must always remain relevant, to the world, and as well as its closest neighbors. Because I think so long as we maintain our relevance on our own terms, whether we serve as, a conduit for foreign investments, into neighboring countries, or whether, we provide, that regional hub status, that enables other countries to tap into. I think all this does play a part in ensuring that Singapore, continue to have good ties, with Malaysia and Indonesia. And we are continually trying to, make ourselves relevant on our own terms, but also, trying to demonstrate, that a successful Singapore is no threat to Malaysia or Indonesia. And likewise, a successful Indonesia and Malaysia, will actually be good for Singapore as well. So when you look at the bilateral ties, Singapore and Malaysia, which is the busiest land crossing in the world, with close to 500,000 people coming to and fro each day, ties are growing, right? So there is near completion, a rapid transit system, between Singapore and Johor Bahru, which is the capital of the most southernmost Malaysian state. And that's going to just, improve, people to people movement. There are plans for a special economic zone, in Johor as well. And all this goes back to, the whole idea of, Singapore being able to use, the neighboring countries as its economic hinterland. And if you look at Indonesia, with Indonesia planning to move its capital to, to the island of, to Kalimantan, Singapore companies are also assessing, how they could invest, in that new venture. But I would say, I think all the leaders, you have in Indonesia a new leadership coming in later this year. And I think, the signs are that things are looking up, but we will always have to be prepared, for the occasional downturn. And I think this is part and parcel of international relations.
That's really interesting. I want to pick up on two themes that I think you touched on there. One is this sense, which is always very striking when one listens to Singaporean diplomats or politicians or academics such as you. This idea that Singapore is so conscious of the fact that it always needs to be exceptional. It always needs to go above and beyond to remain relevant. And I think it's just such a healthy attitude in life, but at the level of states too, and it's true, of course, because it's so small that it's inherently vulnerable, right? So it has to kind of maintain that attitude. And the other thing you mentioned, which I think is really interesting and kind of segues neatly into the next point I want to touch on, is this idea of trade, right? Trade as a vehicle for peace. This idea that, okay, well, the stronger the kind of interrelation is between Singapore and its neighbors on an economic and commercial level, the likelier it is that also just on a kind of popular level that the idea of war in a certain sense will become unthinkable by analogy with what happened in Europe after the war, right, with the creation of the customs union, the common market, et cetera. Although we're a long way away from that in your neck of the woods, but still,
definitely.
But there's that. But what we're seeing also in the world today is kind of an interesting kind of retrenchment in a sense as far as trade is concerned, because of course trade is at the heart of the conflict between, or the rivalry, however you want to call it, between the U.S. and China, right? And I want to ask you about Singapore's kind of position in that struggle, because one of the main kind of bones of contention in the trade issues, which actually have now expanded just beyond just the U.S. and China. Now Europe is very worried about it, and other countries too, is of course China's need to dump its excess product on the rest of the world because its domestic demand is too weak, right? And that has to do with the political economy of China as a state, et cetera. But Singapore, how do you see Singapore playing that kind of game? Because on the one hand, it wants to maintain cordial relations with both, right? On the other hand, Singapore itself has a relatively high manufacturing share of GDP. It's a very globalized economy. It needs flows in and out. So where do you think the dangers lie, and how do you think Singapore is gonna try and position itself?
I think that's an excellent point, David. I think when you look at the Sino-American rivalry, which is not just over trade, but in so many other areas, military competition, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles and whatnot. But it is the defining rivalry of our time.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen, in this geopolitical competition, is going to make a world of difference, to many countries. And for Singapore, we are so dependent on the world. We are a city-state. At our widest, we're just 42 kilometers. You run a marathon, you would have, ran across, the widest part of Singapore. But trade is 3 times our gross domestic product. Very few countries have this sort of proportion, but it just demonstrates how we are so dependent on the world. And so you're right, that if that anything untoward were to happen to the global trading system, or if there's conflict, in Singapore's backyard, whether in Southeast Asia or East Asia or the South China Sea, all that is not going to be good for Singapore.
Right.
And both countries are vital to Singapore. I mean, if I could just rattle off some statistics. I mean, when you look at the China, it may amaze some people, right? When they learn that Singapore is the largest foreign investor in China. China is Singapore's largest trading partner. And America is also, the largest investor in Singapore. So in many ways, we tread that very fine line
Right.
in trying to ensure, that we continue to maintain good ties, with both powers. Regardless of how ties between America and China are. And I think it's absolutely vital, that both China and America, continue to be engaged in Asia, right? Whether we are looking at particularly in Southeast Asia, because I think when, as you pointed out earlier, when an external party has a stake in the success and well-being of a particular region, let's say in this case Southeast Asia, then I think they'll be very careful and mindful about what they do, right? Because if anything untoward were to happen, they too, will be impacted. So for a long time, Singapore, as well as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right, a collection of 10 Southeast Asian nations, the premise has always been, we need a balance of power, right? We need all powers, middle powers, superpowers, to be engaged in the region, because that helps to ensure, that all these powers, have a stake in the success and well-being of Southeast Asia. So there's no doubt about, in Singapore, the leaders watching, that rivalry very closely.
Yes, no, absolutely. And there have been two issues that kind of on the global stage, which have made, to some extent, the two most significant wars at the moment, the one in Ukraine and the one in Gaza, or Israel Gaza, because it really extends to up to the northern border with Lebanon as well. Which again show in great contrast the difficulties that a small state like Singapore, which has to constantly balance relations with the great powers, the challenge that such a state faces. Right, on the one hand, with the Gaza issue, with to some extent it's a domestic issue, obviously in Singapore because of the Muslim community. But Singapore has tried to play its part. It has engaged in humanitarian airdrops in Gaza when that was still a thing. I'm not sure if they're still going on. And interestingly, the Foreign Affairs Minister Balakrishnan a couple of weeks ago in Parliament actually stated that Singapore would be prepared, at least in principle, whatever that means, to recognize a Palestinian state if such a state also accepted Israel's right to exist, so on and so forth. On the other hand, Singapore has always had, since its inception, very close defense ties with Israel, right? So there's that balancing act. Then on the Ukraine issue, Singapore has been quite explicit, I think, in a very healthy way compared to some other countries in the UN about the fact that, look, we're dealing with a flagrant violation of all conceivable norms of international relations here. Russia simply invaded its neighbor, period. But on the other hand, China is very much enabling Russia. And so to the extent that Singapore wants to, maintain cordial relations, at least with China, it has to kind of balance on that issue too. So could you help us kind of try to make sense of how Singapore has to kind of juggle all these balls in the air at the same time?
No, excellent point, David. I think when you look at Singapore's foreign policy profile, I think it has become a lot more prominent, in the last couple of years. And you rightly pointed out, how in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Singapore has imposed, sanctions on Russia. And I think it all goes back, to the basic point about, speaking and acting in a principled manner on the international stage. We cannot afford, we meaning Singapore, we cannot afford to have a situation where, another country, a bigger neighbor, were to find some excuse, based on a false reading of history and whatnot, to intrude into our sovereignty.
Right.
And I think it is important, for small states, to speak up, when the opportunity is there, because if small states don't speak up, then when the time comes when they need others to speak up for them,
Right.
then that may not happen. So I think that's critical. And you're right to say that, Singapore certainly supports, a negotiated two-state solution, with regard to Israel and the Palestinian people, right? And this negotiated two-state solution, has to be consistent with relevant United Nations Security Council, resolutions, because I think Singapore, like many other countries, take the view that this is only how, lasting peace, could be brought, to this very long-standing, conflict. But it goes back, I mean, you painted the scenario very well. How, a city-state like Singapore, we have to, demonstrate, that small states matter, and that the voices of small states, must be respected on the international arena, and then that means, being able to act with credibility, with legitimacy, and so I think, even Singaporeans are finding it a bit hard to see Singapore taking such a frontal position, on some of these major conflicts around the world. But I think it's necessary, right? I think the time has come, where, we need to ensure, that the international rule of law prevails, and that, countries find peaceful means, to resolve differences between them. And that has been the case. We have long-standing disagreements, over territorial boundaries, with Malaysia and Indonesia, use of airspace and all.
Right.
We have subjected those disagreements, to international tribunals, such as International Court of Justice.
Right. Like the Pedra Branca issue, right?
Correct. Yeah, and all this is really, to say that, that there can be peaceful means of, finding resolution, right? And that it is better, to go down this path, than to go down the path of, tension and conflict or even violence.
No, absolutely. And Singapore has had more clear-sighted gumption, I think, as far as speaking out is concerned than many European states even, because Singapore knows that if this becomes the accepted norm, then that you can just simply take other states' territory on the basis of spurious pseudo historical claims, then other states might get that idea too, right? and then we're back to the law of the jungle.
Correct, absolutely, right, and you're right. We need international rule of law to prevail, right? Because the alternative, right, the law of the jungle, right, is one where small states, are not going to come out looking good. So I think it is important, that when we have the voice, we should speak up, and hopefully, that will also encourage, more countries, to take a firm stance, as to some of these defining issues of our times.
Indeed, yeah. I want to turn now to Singapore's domestic policy and the domestic issues that Singapore is confronting. They're perhaps less well known here in the West, but I think they're just as fascinating as Singapore's role kind of on the global stage. And as I said in the intro, it's an interesting time for this handover to 4G or the fourth generation, because it's also the timing is such that it's coming towards the tail end of the term of government, which, in other words, meaning that the general election will have to come up fairly soon. And I want to ask you about that in just a moment, but I wanted to start off first by asking you something maybe a little different, which is one thing I noticed is that in the kind of weeks and months leading up to the handover in mid-May, so just a couple months ago, Lawrence Wong, who was at that point still DPM, was portrayed in a way that was, I think, different from previous handovers. Let's say there was one video of him, playing the guitar and kind
Yes.
of making him seem like a nice guy, kind of thing, And on some level, it's kind of a banal, trivial issue. But on the other hand, it's, I think, kind of an interesting point because if we cast our minds back to, the first G, as it were, Lee Kuan Yew and his team, it's, I think, impossible to imagine him playing the guitar, right?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Exactly, right? In an effort to woo voters or to seem personable or whatever. So I think there's an interesting point there, which I wanted to ask you about. Is this kind of a symptom of, or does this presage, in a certain sense, a gradual shift to a more kind of American or presidential style of politics, even in the PAP? Where the leading politicians have to be portrayed in the media, even to Singapore's own domestic constituency, as kind of personable individuals, as opposed to just
Yep.
iron-fisted leaders, as it were.
I think that's a very astute observation. I think politics have evolved. The tight control that the founding generation of leaders led by Lee Kuan Yew, that suited those tumultuous times.
Right.
But if today's leadership were to adopt the same style, I don't think they're going to get very far, because we are looking at at a Singapore population where majority are now born post-independent, right? And in many ways, the
Including Wong himself.
oh yes, I mean he's the first Singapore Prime Minister to be born post-independence, right? So you're right. I mean it's my parents' generation, my grandparents, were totally enamored with Singapore's third world to first world transformation, in one generation. But my son's generation, I mean, to them, all they know is a first world Singapore. And I think, that also takes place against the backdrop of the PAP, the People's Action Party, the ruling party. It has governed Singapore uninterrupted since 1959. And many young people take the view that, it's not just only an aberration, but perhaps even a freakish state of existence, and so that there is the need, to demonstrate that one party dominance, is still relevant, right? So this year marks, 65 years of, PAP's rule, in Singapore. But I think, you're right to say that, politicians have to evolve, their way of engaging, with Singaporeans, and in many ways, that means portraying themselves like one of us,
Right.
showing that they are relatable, showing that they are just like you and me. And although I hope that we don't go down the style of personality politics,
Mm-hmm.
where it's just form. I think it's
Yeah.
important, for there to be substance. Form, well, it has to evolve. And I think we're seeing that in Singapore today.
I wanted to ask you something about a kind of yearly ritual, as it were, in Singapore, the National Day Rally, which takes place in mid-August for Independence Day, and it's a kind of an element of continuity amidst all the discontinuity of the past decades, because, as I say, it's a yearly event. And I think it's one of these important commemorative sort of events because it brings the nation together, as you said earlier. The current generation has no memory of the struggles and the challenges of founding Singapore and separating from Malaysia and going through the process of rapid industrialization and everything. So it's an opportunity for the generations to come together, for the various ethnic and religious communities to come together. So I think it plays an underestimated role in the continuous weaving together of the social fabric of the nation. What do you think PM Wong will want to touch on this year as kind of the main themes for his speech?
Well, it is, of course, the most important political speech, of the year, and this year's one will be much anticipated, because it will be Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's, first National Day rally, and after 20 National Day rallies, by his predecessor, I think Singaporeans will be very keen, to see how, the Prime Minister addresses the nation. And I think what he will need to do, and I think what he intends to do, will be to paint his vision, for Singapore, under his leadership. I think he has, over the last 2 months and prior to that, been giving some indications, right? A more caring society, a renewal of the social compact. But I think it's really time to get down, to the brass tacks, such as, how are we going to get there, right? So beyond, the ambition, how are we going to get there? How are we going to get people to rally behind, the government of the day? So I think, he will obviously be painting some of the challenges, that are confronting Singapore. Not all of them will be new, but the question of, how are we going to deal with them, is something that Singaporeans would want to know. And I think Singaporeans will also want to know, how they can get involved, in this next stage of nation building.
Yeah, yeah, which is again such a healthy and instructive example of the importance of having that sense of service to the nation, right? You really feel it when you're there, the sense that, citizens have a role to play in every day, reconstructing, as it were, the imagined community that is a nation, especially in the case of Singapore, which doesn't have a kind of homogeneous ethnic makeup and, is very much an imagined community.
But definitely, right? I mean, Ernest Renan talked about nation building being a daily plebiscite,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, we still continue to have significant immigration, right? 1/3 of the people living in Singapore are not citizens, and because we're under reproducing,
Yeah.
there is a need for immigration to not just augment in terms of quantity, but also in terms of, the quality of the people. So nation building is always ongoing, right? Trying to get people who are the newcomers, the new joiners, to not just appreciate Singapore for its material benefits, but also to recognize, what is it that makes Singapore unique.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, and it's again that it just shows why it's Singapore is a small state, but there's so much to learn from even just its the way it goes about creating a national consensus around all kinds of potentially very divisive issues, right? There are the challenges, as you said, of demography, which is a challenge that many, if not all, advanced economies have. So, there's the question of how much, do you balance the needs of the economy versus the needs of, again, social cohesion, right? So it's so interesting to see how, Singapore manages to deal with these issues without all the kind of Sturm und Drang that these issues create in Western societies, right? Which love to kind of pat themselves on the back about being, more liberal or caring more about X and Y kind of rights and so on and so forth. But actually, when it comes down to the actual lived daily experience of citizens in a community, right, in a national community, I think there's a lot to learn from the example of Singapore.
Well, but David, I think it's also important, to say that Singapore is by no means a perfect society. I
Sure,
think
sure.
you're right. You're right to say that, there's a lot more emphasis on community, over individualist interests and all.
Hmm.
But society is also changing. Western Western values in some respects to continue to uh, have its draw, in Singapore, and in a more connected world, people look at how politics and society are organized, in other parts of the world, and sometimes, it may well be, that you do have segments of Singaporeans, who wish for a lot more excitement,
Yeah.
in the business of governing, and so, trying to accommodate, the different perspectives on politics in Singapore, is something which, the government of the day, will have to continue to deal with.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'm tempted to say, as far as more exciting politics is concerned, beware what you wish for.
Oh,
But
definitely, yes.
but in any event, let me because we're coming towards the end, Professor Tan. Let me end just with a more straightforwardly political question, just in terms of the transition. When do you, as I said, the transition and the end of government have kind of overlapped in terms of the timing. So, when do you expect the general election to occur? And were you surprised by the fact that PM Wong didn't opt to go for a cabinet reshuffle at the moment of handover itself, but rather, maybe later on?
Well, Prime Minister Wong did have a cabinet reshuffle of sorts. I mean, it wasn't a significant one, and so maybe that's where sometimes, the the view from outside is that, there was no reshuffle. Yeah, all the ministers retained their portfolios. He appointed a new deputy prime minister, his co-chair on the COVID-19 multi-ministry task force. No, but I think what Mr. Wong is clearly indicating, is that this is the home stretch, and he wants all his ministers, to consolidate, whatever accomplishments, to tie up the loose ends, so that, the PAP government, will be able to go to the voters, with the best possible, report card. And you're right. I mean, we are looking at, perhaps a consequential general election, the next one, which must be held by November 2025. And I think Mr. Wong is certainly realizes that time is of the essence. He's already making his walkabouts, throughout the island. But I would say that, the elections are probably going to be in the middle of next year, shortly after he delivers, his first budget as prime minister. I mean, he continues to be the finance minister, so this will be his first budget as prime minister and finance minister. And that usually is in February, March, because the new financial year begins in April. And so I would say that, we can expect, the next general election to be sometime in May or June. And I think it's something which, will be important, as a new prime minister. But he is looking at, the big question, how do you demonstrate to Singaporeans that one party dominance, still remains relevant and beneficial to Singapore? So there is that
Yeah.
desire for more political competition and diversity, right? But at the same time, there is also the recognition, that the ruling party has generally kept to its electoral promises, and
Hmm.
so, voters will have that significant decision, to make, within the next year or so.
Yeah, yeah, that'll be very interesting to watch, to see how both the PAP and Singaporean citizens kind of thread that needle, right? As you said, between wanting on the one hand, wanting, especially the younger generation, perhaps wanting, more diversity and, something new. On the other hand, one can't discount the benefits of stability and of experience in office, either. So, very interesting months ahead. Professor Tan, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope to have you back on the podcast sometime soon in the future. Talk about all the other interesting opportunities and challenges facing Singapore in the years ahead.
thank you for this enjoyable conversation. And it's always I think it's always good to to share some things about Singapore. And hopefully, that will increase people's awareness of different modes of governance and different styles of leadership in the world today. But thank you for having me.